Thanks so much, Joel. Also, really appreciate people taking their time out of a Tuesday morning, especially those of you out further west. I know it's early, so really excited to talk about this new conservation movement that's happening in the Great Plains. This session, we're talking about transformation to global change pressure, things like climate change. So this is going to give a pretty major leading example of some of the ways that that's happening here in the Great Plains, and really borrowing from some other efforts that have happened elsewhere. So I should also thank, there's really a host of groups. I mean, I'm presenting this work, but it's a huge team effort. We partner a lot with some of the work that's come out of University of Montana, and the Rangeland analysis platform there with Brady Allred, Dave Noggle, and so forth. So big shout out to them as well this morning. All right, so really, when I remember coming up to Nebraska, and I became a professor up here less than 10 years ago, and there was this discussion on, well, how big of an issue is woody encroachment up here? And this was kind of how we framed it. I mean, we just heard, Ken talk about range condition, and really over the last 25 years, the discipline has been obsessed a bit with understanding these alternative states and state transitions and how those play out. And with what we know now, we would expect that the most catastrophic transitions, the most catastrophic regime shifts, are those that transcend scale. So that really represents a grand challenge. If you have state transitions that are transcending scale, they tend to affect every citizen, every person that's tied to those kind of ecosystems. So we're not too concerned about a coral reef that has a small algal patch. That can actually increase diversity. We're not so concerned about a single blowout in the sandhills, but we are concerned if we have whole-scale coral reef collapse due to going from a productive to unproductive algal-dominated system. We're concerned about things like the Dust Bowl, and we saw the scaling up of that kind of change. And likewise, we're not really concerned about planting a windbreak, in the middle of our most intact prairies, but we are concerned if those windbreaks result in encroachment and the scaling up of a regime shift on millions of acres of rangelands. And like everything, we're really good at responding to those changes after they occur with data. So we're really good ambulance drivers in terms of natural resources and responding to crisis. But it's been a challenge to try and prevent state transitions, try and prevent these regime shifts as they occur. So we're a little less successful at preventative care. Now, make no doubt about it, when we're talking about woody encroachment in the Great Plains, or we're talking about cheatgrass, out west, in the Great Basin, for example, success stories at large scales are exceedingly rare, and that becomes really our challenge. These types of large scale transitions, we've tied it to every aspect of our way of life: food production, water, increased diseases, school funding, wildlife, et cetera. We can go on and on. Like, these kind of things that transcend scale really affect us. And so I really want to focus on that as we go forward, of how do we impact these types of changes when it's not just on a patch, it's not just on a single property. We're talking about, entire regions that are undergoing transformation and collapse. So in response to this, what happened in the last year, and I'll kind of jump to the conclusion at the end, but we've actually seen major transformation as a result of the types of data that are available and responding to these types of biome scale threats. So not too long ago, of course, like the sage grouse initiative was a great example of trying to scale up for conservation action. The Great Plains now has a Great Plains grasslands biome framework for conservation action. So you can find this online. It's on the NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife website. And this is the first biome-scale framework for America's grasslands from the NRCS. This is the NRCS's contribution to things like the Central Grassland Roadmap, which is a tri-national effort for biodiversity conservation in the face of global change pressures. So think about what's happening. The entire system in the Great Plains, right? I mean, we've lost 2.9 billion grassland birds since 1970. That was the science paper. We're seeing groups start to scale up how they're planning and how they're thinking about conservation this century. We're talking about now biomes being at risk and biome conservation. Of course, it's not just that. The Great Plains is really the powerhouse of the beef industry and our most productive rangelands that exist in North America. So you're seeing a major call for action as a result of changes in resource values in this part of the world. Now, it's been pretty exciting to see how these changes have taken place. And so what we're seeing is this kind of rapid collaboration, iteration, and real-time adoption of taking like these types of frameworks, and those frameworks inform the types of technology we need. And I'll show you a couple of glimpses of what's coming. But that technology starts to drive implementation. So as that Great Plains Biome Framework came out, groups like Kansas NRCS released Great Plains Grasslands Initiative. Nebraska just released theirs. South Dakota is working on releasing theirs for 2023. Oklahoma just launched one as well. So we're talking about multiple states saying this is how we're going to implement that framework, leveraging modern technology. And of course, we're not just interested in dollars spent and acres treated. Can we measure the outcomes and the benefits to ecosystem services of that type of implementation? As that happens and we get better outcomes, that starts to reinforce changes and revisions in these frameworks. So this iteration that I'm showing you here, this is how we're operationalizing transformation internally as part of this national science team with Working Lands for Wildlife. It's really been exciting to be part of because we've just seen it move much faster across groups and really a lot more real-time engagement adoption. Now, kind of the chase, the data is just really clear on this. There are two major drivers of that are the biome threats in the Great Plains. So now that we have the kind of data we do, it's become clearer, like in the Great Plains, we're talking about land use conversion due to especially agriculture and woody encroachment. And so if you look at that graph on the left, those two are now occurring at the same rate. That's pretty shocking in the Great Plains, given that, if we make a decision to plow up grassland tomorrow, right, it occurs overnight. But woody encroachment tends to be a much slower process that we tend to think of over this slow decadal change. So we're starting to see this move so rapidly. And of course, climate change is known to exacerbate that, that we're actually seeing them occur at the same rate today. So these are your two biome scale threats. Other threats are more local. Also, of course, important, as Ken was talking about in the previous talk. But the two biome threats, of course, are driving change in the Great Plains grasslands. So look at this cultivation risk map that's part of this plow print layer. Everywhere that is white on this map are areas that are already converted. So you see that red checkerboard. That's kind of CRP within 70% areas already converted. In the Great Plains, where you have encroachment, though, is everywhere with low cultivation risk. So the Southern Great Plains, you can see all those areas of low cultivation risk, and they have trees in them. And over time, we've been able to track those and how they're moving now and affecting the central and portions of the Northern Great Plains. So it's not the tractor, it's the trees. That's what we're seeing play out. Now, the Central Grasslands Roadmap used that to develop this Great Plains Grasslands Risk Map. And you can find this on their website, but it produces a combined layer. So that's what happens if you combine them. So you can start to see our core areas. All of a sudden, we have very few that are remaining that are large and intact at a biome level. So the sum of this story is that this is just the state of our biome in the Great Plains. We're talking about 130 million acres at risk of woody encroachment or further agricultural conversion. And we're already hemorrhaging biodiversity and conservation losses tied to these two biome threats. So if we aren't able to adapt and change how we're managing rangelands, right, out of the old model that didn't have these kind of pressures, we're really going to struggle in the Great Plains going forward. And I think that's something really important for everyone to hear. Make no doubt about it, no group of rangeland professionals have had to deal with this scale of conversion and pressure. And are we able to adapt in our profession fast enough, given what continues to take place in this region? Now, all this became really possible, and that's what's, I guess, unfortunate and challenging. We just didn't have the kind of data and technology in rangelands to promote these types of transformation. So now that we have things like the Rangeland Analysis Platform, we can track every major functional group with rangeland vegetation for every pixel, all the way going back from 1984 to present. For me, this was like Pandora's box. We could really start to tell a more complete story, and we could start to compare in the Great Plains. What are our bigger challenges? Is it, annuals? Is it bare ground? Is it trees? And we can start to prioritize accordingly. So great shout out here to friend and colleague Brady Allred for having the foresight to develop it. And this starts helping us connect those kind of theories associated with state transitions and how they're playing out. Now, NRCS responded to this overnight and really contributed 10 million acres from state NRCS leadership to start tackling this issue. We actually showed how to scale up our management and cost effectiveness of woody encroachment. And the other big one, of course, is land use conversion and classical applications of CRP. In both cases, we're talking about efforts that are meant to conserve and anchor to more intact grassland conservation efforts, scale up what we've done in the past, and really try and do a better job of sustaining and managing these really important grassland areas that are left. This is something that, again, you can find this online. I've got some links that I can provide. But there's two sections in this, one associated with land use conversion, one associated with woody encroachment. For time's sake today, and because we're really seeing transformation on woody encroachment, I'm going to talk about it. So this is a kind of what the big change we're seeing. Instead of just restoring areas that have been lost to woody encroachment, we're starting to better understand that approach just is doomed to fail. If you clear like what you're seeing in that photo, there's seed, right, with mechanical remover, those seed left everywhere in that rangeland. So what's going to happen? It's going to grow new trees, which then means you have to cut it again, which means you get the horrible quote from my training in Texas, which is you had to sell the ranch 3 times to pay for brush management. We've now, with partnerships with large-scale private lands efforts, it's just been proven that a better approach is when you're able to reduce that risk in the first place. It's kind of invasive species 101, prevent it from occurring in the first place, anchor to your more intact areas, and then start pushing against it. If we're going to manage woody encroachment, we have to disrupt its biological mechanism for spread, which is seed. We only managed and targeted taller, mature trees. And that's really where our guidance was doomed to fail. This was part of the multi-state extension effort in the Great Plains that we helped lead. There was 19,000 copies requested for printing and mailing. As a result of it, we really view this as better management practices, or evolving our best management practices to better deal with woody encroachment. It's meant to reduce risk and vulnerability. For those of you that know this kind of risk and vulnerability frameworks for climate change, it borrows from that same framework. When we're talking about what drives risk, we're talking about sensitivity and exposure. So what did we miss? We missed thinking about exposure. Proximity to seed sources is more important in the data now than what management you use. So the number one predictor is just how close you are to a seed source. That's a big change in understanding from what we had in the past. So check this vulnerability guide out. Really provides a lot better information on how we can manage these issues at scale, and start to win the war a little bit on woody encroachment here. Now, to give you some background on this, look at this kind of data that we can now generate. So when we talk about, right, the scale at which regime shifts are occurring, we were interested in seeing how big can we see these transitions taking place. So think of the state of our biome. Everywhere you're seeing that's red is dominated by woodies. Everywhere we're dominated by grasses or blue. To give you an example, that red spot in the middle of Nebraska is Halsey National Forest, where we planted cedar trees in the middle of sandhills. So everywhere red looks more like that than our more intact grassland area. course, here's your western boundary where the Great Plains ends. Here's that eastern boundary in 2000. Now, we don't care where these boundaries exist, but we do care if they move. So that's 2018. So just in case there's a little bit of lag here, that's 2000. This is 2018. This is biome scale alternative states or biome scale transitions. We're talking about the collapse of the biome in half of my lifetime. Our systems are rapidly changing. And are we keeping pace with this type of change at this regional scale? I mean, North America's grassland is collapsing. And we are chasing this transition into more intact areas. We spent $177 million in the last farm bill on brush management. Where do we spend that money? We spend it in the red, and we spend it on small acres because it costs hundreds of dollars if you wait. What if we spent that money getting ahead of woody encroachment, paralyzing it and pushing back against it? You can see the Flint Hills burns 2 million acres a year. It looks more like a paleo relic, like the Black Hills of South Dakota. This is the only region that's even made this biome collapse flinch. And of course, their management's had to go up because now they're surrounded by a woody biome state. So this is the kind of challenge we have against us, but also where that guidance starts helping us adapt and change and transform going forward. Now, this is these signals serve as an early warning. Everywhere yellow that you're seeing on these maps become red. It's an early warning for these regime shifts taking place. And of course, one of the classic ones that past postdoc Caleb Roberts had done was tie this to prairie chickens. So for example, as these transitions are taking place, you just have increasingly unusable habitat space. And so what do you want to do? Well, this is simple. If you care about chickens, keep the blue, right? Like you want to avoid these transitions at large scales because that's what's critical for grassland dependent wildlife. So keep the blue because prairie chickens avoid it. And so do multiple other species that we've started to tie this to. Now, if you don't care about chickens, and of course this is rangelands, maybe you care about agricultural production coming out of rangelands. So this is something that Scott Morford out of the University of Montana is leading. We can now track how many tons of production are lost to woody encroachment. This signal you're seeing here provides early warning for losses in rangeland production. So Nebraska, right? Like we lost 419,000 tons in 2019 to woody encroachment. So everybody can start figuring out how many tons that actually is. It's a huge amount. Well, of course, Nebraska used to look like South Dakota. So the warning to South Dakota is that look at where you're going to be going long term. They've lost 145,000 tons now. Well, of course, Kansas used to look like Nebraska. They're now up to 2 million tons. Oklahoma used to look like Kansas. They're up to 4.4 million tons. And that's just what's in our rangelands. So the longer we keep waiting and not securing our best grasslands left, we're just constantly having to manage woody encroachment on every square inch. And if we think that it's not going to happen there, the data keeps showing it's happening in places it's never happened before. So these early warning signals can really help us get out in front of it if we can really help advance transformation in the coming decade. Now, this product will be available later this year, but you can actually see these trends and what's happening for each county. So finally, rangeland production statistics will match the rest of ag communications, right? Like how much corn was grown in Osborne County, Kansas, or how many soybeans. We now have the same data for rangelands. We're finally playing the same game in rangelands that the rest of agriculture does in the Great Plains. We grow a ton of biomass here in the Great Plains. We just haven't communicated it. What did we say in rangelands? Like, well, here's how many pounds per acre, how many grams per meter squared I had. We never really talked about how big this is for statewide agriculture. And so that's something we've now have that we're really excited about because it's really helping to foster change. If you're seeing these dips in rangeland production, check out those early warning signals. Like we want to avoid that from happening in the first place. So if we're seeing those early warning signals, we want to act sooner before we get to the levels that we're observing in Osborne County, Kansas, for example. If we're going to do that, like this is a great graphic and kind of sums up just the change. Instead of really expensive treatments after we have a major crisis or concern, get out in front of it, anchor to intact grasslands, start to arrest that dispersal and recruitment and then push against it. So there's this kind of mantra that's taken off that's being shared across regions of defend the core, grow the core. This is a great example of that. Don't constantly manage reinvasion, because if you don't manage this yellow, that'll become encroachment and look red in the future. So there's just this key thing that we missed biologically of how we ought to better manage encroachment. The lack of doing that is why we're losing our biome. So this is what really that Great Plains Grassland Initiative, this guidance, that biome framework, it's really trying to operationalize this style of information coupled with that technology to get out in front of our biome scale threats. And maybe that way we can have more success this coming decade. We're starting to see that with both things like CRP and woody encroachment. These are two great examples. And ultimately, I think this is key. Like, we're not going to get too far ahead on these types of threats and issues when we're talking about climate change, biome scale threats associated with invasive species or land use conversion, if it's not directly coupled and tied with private lands. If we're going to really win, align with this mission, these are the groups that are reinforcing that culture and have the best potential to really reinforce this whole effort long term. So none of it's really possible if we're not directly interacting with them. So with that, I'll leave you with one of the last major intact prairies in the Great Plains. This picture of the sandhills. Talk about a grassland that's treeless at large scales. These are pretty rare nowadays of seeing a horizon like that. Thanks for talking about this morning, and really looking forward to other speakers in this session. So thanks, Joel.